Evening everyone. We're going to be talking about a policy that almost everyone has heard of. Everyone has some sort of connection to it, but very few people understand it. We are talking about WA Workers' Compensation Insurance. I'm going to try and simplify this policy as best as I can. Just know it is a very complex policy and there is a lot of moving parts. Let's get to it. First of all, each state here in Australia is completely different with how they handle workers' compensation. For example, here in WA, brokers can procure insurance policies, workers' comp insurance policies on behalf of clients. And we also get to deal with 5 separate insurers. Compared to the rest of the state, it's a little bit different. For example, over in Queensland, no insurance companies are involved, no brokers are involved. Clients deal directly with the governing body over there. So note that each state is completely different. Now, if you have workers that are based in one place, one state, but work in another state, it can get a little bit more complex. Then we have these things called state of connection tests. And then that will ensure that the right workers are insured under the right policy. Now, what does workers' compensation cover? It covers personal injury suffered in connection with business activities. Not limited to location, not limited to time. The only thing that isn't included with workers' compensation is cover to and from the first workplace or their workplace. Basically, the first trip of the day and the last trip of the day aren't covered under workers' compensation. That's why you need a journey personal accident policy to fill in that little gap there. Who needs a workers' compensation policy? That's anyone who is employing a worker under the legislation. That legislation is the Workers' Compensation and Injury Management Act of 1981. That legislation is very thick. There's a lot to it. So I'm going to simplify basically who needs to cover or who needs a workers' compensation policy. What's a worker? Basically, a worker is a part-time or a full-time general employee. Need a workers' comp for them. If you're engaging any sole trading or any partnership contractors, they're also going to be deemed a worker of yours under the legislation. You also need to cover them. Working directors have the choice to be covered. Working directors of a proprietary limited company can choose to be covered under the policy. For a public company, they cannot be insured. Then outside of that, you can procure a personal accident policy for the working directors. Here in WA, workers' compensation is governed by WorkCover WA. They oversee all of the general insurers. They also release the rates that the general insurers must follow every year. 30th of June, effective rates. Now, these rates, basically what am I talking about? These gazetted rates is basically a list of hundreds of ANZIC codes. These ANZIC codes describe activities or occupations. And then attaching to that is a personal injury rate. The higher the rate, the higher the risk of personal injury. For example, an office risk, so for example, insurance broking, we have a very low gazetted rate. I think it is around 0.26%. Someone who is a heavy diesel mechanic, they will have a higher rate generally of 2, maybe 3%, depending exactly what they're doing. The higher the rate, the more the wages, the more the premium. Or the higher the rate, the more the premium that the insured must pay. Now, insurers can choose to load or discount the gazetted rate based on their aversion or their proclivity towards that risk exposure. For example, one insurer may dislike heavy diesel mechanics, so then they'll load it. But the next insurer, they may love diesel mechanics, so they'll discount it. So it's very important that your broker is testing the market, he's made formal submissions to the market and gets formal terms back. Don't need to do it too often. It only needs to be done, again, I've spoken about this in previous videos, no more than every 3 years unless there is a change in the guidelines. right? Where an insurer basically goes from loving a risk to absolutely hating it, and your rate goes from X all the way up to Z. That's when the only exception there. What is included in workers' compensation? So first of all, under the policy, you have cover for ACT benefits. Under the legislation, there are prescribed limits for such things as wages or weekly entitlements, rehab, medical expenses, permanent impairment, travel. There's some of the majors, all right? And they're prescribed. So there is an upper limit, or there is a limit to those ACT benefits. If your worker is injured and they suffer an injury that goes over 15% whole person impairment, then they are entitled to make a common law claim. They have to prove negligence. It's not too hard. Generally, it's a breach of OH&S, safe systems of work, safe plant equipment, training and education. If you slip anywhere there, then there can be a common law claim. If that whole person impairment goes over 25%, then they are entitled to uncapped common law. Capped common law is at 50 million. Generally, when there is a common law claim afoot, then that worker will engage a legal provider. Your insurer will deal with that legal provider. That legal provider will act on the worker's behalf. There are three classes of workers under the workers' compensation policy. You have general employees, that's full-time and part-time. You have working directors for a proprietary limited, as we've discussed before, and then you have contractors. Now, that is generally sole trading contractors or partnership contractors who can't get their own policies. Proprietary limited contractors, they will have their own policy. They should have their own policy. You should vet that every year. And then also, without going into too much detail in this video, there should be a contractor agreement in place which can have certain clauses in there which can protect you. That is on a different video. I've spoken about contracts before. When it comes to a claim, the worker is injured. It's an unfortunate circumstance, but it does happen. First of all, use common sense. Pretty straightforward. They'll go to a doctor. The doctor will then send them to either a psychologist if it's a stress claim or a mental injury claim, or if they've strained something, then generally it goes to a physio. That GP will provide a first medical certificate. You need to provide that first medical certificate along with claim form 2B, so completed by the worker, and then the employer's report to your insurer for there to be a claim. From there, the insurer will appoint a claims person, in-house of course. That claims person will deal with the worker as well as the employer, and at times, depending on how serious the injury is, the broker can become involved. Generally, brokers are very, very important. We are very, very important when it comes to moving a claim forward. Claims people are under a lot of pressure, and there can always be circumstances and issues which hold things up. So brokers can be very, very important in moving things forward towards a settlement. When it comes to a workers' compensation claim, when there is personal injury, there can also be a concurrent breach of OH&S by the company directors that can be taken, okay? There can be a workers' compensation policy, and then there can also be a breach of OH&S. That's under OH&S legislation. That's why management liability is so very, very important to have for a company as well. So, with the coverage of workers and coverage for the directors as well as the company itself, we've not only spoken about WA workers' compensation, we've also spoken about a journey policy covered to and from the workplace, and then we've also touched on management liability as well, which would cover a breach of OH&S. So the rabbit hole does go very, very deep when it comes to covering your workers. Also, with a workers' compensation policy here in WA, we can get extensions. This is where it does get a little bit more complex. Under workers' compensation here, we can get extensions such as principals indemnity, claims experience discounts, industrial diseases common law, additional common law, overseas common law. There is many extensions that we can get, but it is completely client dependent. I hope that gives you a really brief overview of workers' compensation, how it works, who needs to get the policy, and how important a broker is who understand workers' compensation, who can help you. If you have any questions or queries, or you need help with workers' compensation, please reach out. We're here to help.